How might we conceptualize the relationships of media in urban politics today? Media Practices and Urban Politics, Conceptualizing the Powers of the Media-Urban Nexus, a paper recently published in Society and Space, proposes we take a much broader view of media than is usually advanced in conventional accounts of urban politics. It does so by engaging in emerging literature focused on what the authors label the media-urban nexus. At the same time, the paper argues we should avoid seeing media as exterior forms of agency. Instead, media should be understood in terms of its experience and enactment through practices. I'm Tim Markham, reader in journalism and media at Birkbeck, University of London. I'm joined by the paper's authors, Scott Rodgers, Clive Barnett and Allan Cochrane. We're going to explore some of the main themes of this paper, and along the way we're also going to reflect a little on the process that led up to the paper's final form. It's a paper with a long evolution, so there's also a story to tell about collaboration, accidents, and not necessarily rushing ideas. Slow theory, we might call it. Now, I'd like to start with the paper's title, and specifically the term urban politics. Theorising urban politics is probably the paper's main object, and you begin by identifying a conceptual shift in the literature, from a politics in the city to a politics of the city. Allan, I was wondering if you could give some background around why this conceptual shift is so important for the arguments made in the paper.
This is one of the things that goes way back in terms of our discussions. We organised a session many years ago about where is urban politics at the Association of American Geographers Conference. And we were trying to open up ways of thinking about urban politics which broke, if you like, with some previous or traditions of thinking through urban politics, which tended to focus on what is urban politics, what is the nature of the politics that emerges from the spaces of the city. And we wanted to say, actually, there's a prior question, there is something else that needs to be thought about, which is about the nature of the urban. What do we mean by urban? What makes particular politics urban? And we were dissatisfied, really, with, if you like, the dominant way of thinking, which, in a sense, took the urban for granted. It's agglomeration, it's bounded, it's spaces that you can say, this is the city. We wanted to suggest, actually, that politics might play a part in constructing our understanding of the urban, of the city. And that's one of the things that we wanted to explore in our work. And this has come out in, recently, it was published as a symposium in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, framed with the notion of where is urban politics. And we brought together a series of papers which came at this question from some very different angles. We think it's not yet determined, if you like, where is urban politics, what the urban of urban politics is. And that's one of the things that, in a way, we take further in the paper in Society and Space that we're talking about. We're beginning to rethink, we're beginning to explore the relationship between politics and the urban, in which we don't take for granted either the process of politics or the nature of the urban.
There are some other important concepts in the title as well, namely media practices and the media-urban nexus. We'll come to both of these in a moment. But Clive, first I'd like you to tell us a bit more about the general tone the paper sets in terms of conceptualizing power. I think you and your co-authors label your conceptualization of media power, even power in general, as modest.
Yes, that's probably a little disingenuous, isn't it? Because we're actually making quite grand claims about our own approach, but I suppose what we're trying to do is move beyond at least a couple of established approaches that we identify in terms of urban studies and geography and related spatial disciplines when it comes to thinking about the relationship between urban politics and the media. And our argument is, at least, that even though you can find quite a lot of work looking at media and urban politics, often the media is thought of as a set of institutions or a set of practices which really kind of sit outside, or at least on the side of the real stuff of urban politics. So you have, for example, work which looks at the role of the media, often kind of primarily thought of classically as the sort of large metropolitan newspaper in a North American city. So the media thought of as, in that sense, as playing some sort of role in kind of growth coalitions or urban regimes, primarily kind of legitimising local elites and the politics and policies of local elites in terms of sustaining particular fractions of capital within the city. And that emphasis sort of also bleeds into kind of another strong emphasis, which is informed much more broadly, I guess, by kind of cultural geography and cultural studies types of methodologies of a certain sort, in which people focus upon how the city is represented in different medium, in film perhaps classically. Both of those approaches actually tend to think of the media primarily as a set of institutions that produce and circulate images and representations, and think of those practices in strongly instrumental terms, so that what the media, what the metropolitan newspaper might be doing is representing certain dominant interests. Perhaps a more culturalist approach, what is being done through those representations is kind of people's subjectivities are being made in certain sorts of ways. So there's an emphasis on the certain things that media does, which I think we find quite interesting, but it ends up being quite a sort of instrumental or purposeful sense that the media can do very strong things, that it can help to legitimise local elites, or it can make up people's subjectivities. And I think we wanted to kind of find a way of thinking around those types of approaches.
Right. So let's turn to the other part of the main title, media practices, a concept that may or may not entirely register for society and space readers. Scott, for starters, could you outline for us where this term comes from and what its implications are?
Well, sure. The term media practices marks what some have called a bit of a turn in media studies. And it really refers to a shift from focusing on media per se, so thinking about media in terms of technologies, texts, or organizations, and instead emphasizing a more phenomenological account of media as experience. So in short, focusing more on what people do with media, or how things are named, imagined as media in the course of practical action. Now, the term has its roots in a particular strand of media research, which we label ethnographic audience studies. Audience studies is really born out of an attempt to get beyond the measurement of media effects, and also at the same time to move beyond functionalist theories of media. So it's all about contingency. It's about studying how media become entangled in various everyday practical environments. Now, there's a bit of a personal narrative here for me. I'm originally a geographer by training, so the idea that I might be able to talk about media in terms of environments has always been really compelling to me. So as I've traveled into the space, the disciplinary space of media studies, and come to teach media students at Birkbeck, I've sort of tended to latch on to environmental concepts. Concepts like domestication, which is one of the key terms we see in audience studies, and it's also something that finds its way into the paper. Now, domestication, I think, is a useful way to introduce this environmental view of media. Domestication really refers to processes whereby once novel media technologies eventually become treated as appliances within everyday routines and spaces. So they basically become invisible, and this invisibility of technologies or media forms like radio or television in everyday practices is what makes them potentially powerful. So what domestication then in turn sort of points to is a naturalized relationship that then gets created between everyday material settings and then more dispersed symbolic worlds. Now, the term domestication can be easily conflated with the private realm, the home in particular, but it does have a more general meaning, which is the ways in which wild technologies become tamed through routinization. So this brings us back to the claim that there's been this more general turn to thinking of media in terms of practices. And most notably, it's introduced as a turn by Nick Coldry in a 2004 paper in the journal Social Semiotics. So you end up with a sort of approach which has a somewhat counterintuitive de-emphasis of media. Sean Moore's drawing on David Morley calls it a non-media centric media studies. So if we come back to our paper, we're sort of chiming in here and saying that to reconceptualize the relationships of media and urban politics, we also need to decenter media. And in particular, we need to move away from a version of media which is theorized as extrinsic to urban politics.
Right. So I think now we have thoroughly unpacked the title of the paper. Moving on to the substance of the paper. The first main section begins, if I may say so, somewhat uniquely, with a contrapuntal reading of two recent attempts to reimagine the Greek polis through our contemporary context. One is broadly situated in urban studies, if focused on citizenship, Engeneisen's being political. The other comes out of media studies, Roger Silverstone's Media and Morality. So, Allan, what's the story behind this juxtaposition?
Partly it is a story, partly it's a story of discovery. Again, it comes back to this notion that you introduced at the beginning of us being engaged in some sort of slow theory building. There's a long history to how we got to where we got to where we are. one of the things that happened, we worked together for a time at the Open University, and many years ago it now seems, Scott was centrally involved with Clive and me in a subsidiary capacity in organising a workshop which was called a Mediapolis, workshop on Mediapolis. We would like inventing new terms, and it was quite a powerful way of thinking, trying to bring together some of the ideas that were coming out in terms of media studies and urban politics, the study of urban politics. But we weren't at that time quite sure how to do this. It was quite difficult. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that at the time, one of the things that came out of this was the discovery of Silverstone's book, was actually to open up and to help us to think slightly differently, both about the media and about polis, about the urban polis. But I think at first, it's fair to say that we saw ourselves as being engaged in exploring contrasting worlds. So exploring the ways in which media studies and Silverstone in particular shaped and understood a rather dispersed notion of polis, contrasting with a more focused, spaced, located, placed form of urban politics, which arguably was there in Engin's discussion of the polis. However, what I would want to suggest, and I think what we would want to suggest, is that actually that initial reading was to miss the point of what was going on. And in fact, what we've moved on to try to explore, and what we do in the paper, is to explore the ways in which these two approaches are actually complementary. They inform each other, or they can inform each other. And they, in fact, in many respects, have quite a shared terrain. We think both of them really take what we think of as a broadly phenomenological approach to political space. So they see it as both being situated and material. So that's quite important, I think, for our thinking. But at the same time, dispersed and symbolic. So it's not one thing or the other. It's important that we can recognise that urban politics is not simply defined by the narrow spaces that often get defined as the city-bounded spaces. In fact, our argument is that it's important to recognise how these things come together to define the city, to define the politics, to define the urban. So that gives us, bringing the two approaches together, we would suggest, and this is the thrust of certainly the first part of the paper, and I think more generally, is that bringing them together allows us to have a more holistic account of what the politics of the city might be, which includes and which emphasises processes of media and, above all, mediation. And these are things that we feel represent significant insights or significantly important ways of taking stuff forward.
Okay, that's interesting, and it brings us to, I think, one of the key aspects of this paper, which is that growing literature providing some ways of thinking about media and mediation in terms of that politics of a city. This is what you label in the paper as the media-urban nexus. Scott, give us a sense of what sort of approach or set of concerns is implied by the term.
Well, the media-urban nexus is a term that we use to point to a set of literatures which see media and cities as intrinsically related. So in the paper, we introduce this literature via Scott McGuire's book, The Media City. Now, McGuire's book doesn't embody the wider literature on the media-urban nexus, but we do use them as a starting point for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it speaks to the deep historical involvement of media within the urban experience. So it's not simply about the new or the digital, for example. And secondly, we find it provides a good way into a style of thinking seen in the literature on the media-urban nexus, and this is one that implicitly emphasizes media thought of as environments. So we give McGuire's discussion of urban illumination as an illustration here, in part because he's taking his cue from McLuhan's famous observation in Understanding Media that electronic light is a medium without content. And what McLuhan meant was light is a medium which we don't regard as media until it is used for content. So, for instance, to project moving images or to spell out letters on a hoarding. But for McLuhan, the content of light itself is the activities that it makes possible. And likewise for McGuire, illumination is a form of urban media because it makes possible previously difficult or unsafe activities. So this is an environmental view of media. It challenges the common assumption that media means identifiable institutions, identifiable texts, or identifiable technologies. Now, granted, illumination is perhaps an extreme example. It's for both McGuire as well as McLuhan, perhaps. but it advances the value of a certain way of thinking about media in general, in that it sees media simultaneously related to non-representational activities, materialities, and also at the same time to symbolic content. Now, in terms of the range of literature that fall under this media-urban nexus, well, it's really too broad and rich to do justice here, and actually for the same reasons we don't try to be exhaustive about it in the paper, but it's worth flagging two prominent lines of inquiry. The first is the ways in which urban surfaces frequently operate as mediums of communication. So, for instance, there's a long history to public notices and signage. There's lots written on outdoor advertising, graffiti and the new street art, dynamic digital screens, often now built directly into buildings. And of course, even design itself. Many are writing around the design of things like public memorials as a form of urban communication. The second prominent line of inquiry is a set of writers dealing with the notion of the digital city in a more holistic way. And particularly, these writers are interested in the pervasiveness of software code via various mundane infrastructures. So this is really going beyond questions around the symbolic complexities of digital representation, so things like visualizations or virtual or augmented reality, and focusing on people's quite ordinary encounters with computational technologies, so via automobiles, for example, security systems, elevators, lifts, etc.
Right. So it's clear that you see this emerging body of literature as offering a more sophisticated and nuanced way of thinking about the relationship of media and cities. But what I find particularly interesting is the way that you insist that when it comes down to questions of political interpretation, this literature still tends to fall back on an implicitly extrinsic reading of media. Clive, could you give us a sense of how this works?
Yeah, this might have something to do with a more general way in which an imperative for social theory to come clean about its politics tends to work. So I think on the one hand we're very sympathetic to the range of work that Scott's just talked about under this broad heading of the media urban nexus, really thinking about the way in which, almost like a media in urbs, if you like, as a way of thinking about the way in which media practices and technologies and genres are embedded in the rhythms of everyday urban life. I think when often people come to respond to the demand to tell others how this is political, you can find various sorts of defaults back to the more conventional ways of thinking about the politics of media that we talked about earlier on. So one version of this would be to start to talk about, quite appropriately, the kind of the interest politics, if you like, around the rolling out of new media technologies and practices in cities. My sort of favourite example of this is a parochial one, but also perhaps not an unusual one. I live in a town called Swindon. It's about sort of an hour or so away from London, between London and Bristol, a town of about 200,000 people or so. For the last 7 or 8 years, Swindon's had this ongoing controversy about the failure of the local council to succeed in its aim of rolling out free Wi-Fi to the whole town. So lots of money has been spent around this initiative, but it's achieved nothing. We do not have free Wi-Fi available in Swindon. Then the controversy then revolves around, well, where's the money gone? This is a question of kind of how local councillors have been engaging with various private businesses which have gone out of business. There's then been campaigns by various activists trying to trace the money. Now, this is a fairly standard type of politics, if you like. It's a same type of politics you might find around housing in Swindon or waste collection in Swindon. In this case, it's that type of politics of campaigning and interests and transparency and accountability, but around a kind of an example of this media urban nexus, because it happens to be a politics around Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi provision, the sort of quintessentially digital sort of practice. So that's one version in which you kind of find not so much a default, but a move towards looking at kind of almost the ordinary politics of this new set of practices. The second example that we kind of indicate in the paper really builds upon or roots back to the one of the themes that Scott mentioned about sort of lots of interesting work about software and digital code and how that is rolled in and embedded into urban infrastructures. That style of work, I think, when it sort of comes to implicitly or explicitly talking about its politics or the political implications of that type of analysis. And also lots of work on affect and non-representational accounts of urban practices. Both of those strands of work have a temptation, it seems to us, to fall back on a kind of almost like a sinister reading of what's going on, because they're both telling stories about how a series of expectations or horizons of behaviour are embedded in backgrounds, either in code or in the design of streets and buildings and so on. And when it comes to sort of telling stories about why that matters, there's an implication that somehow it matters because something sinister is going on, that sort of things are being kind of done behind people's back through code or through the affective attunements of urban environments. Nigel Thrift and Ashar Amin have this nice phrase which exemplifies this style, in which they talk about the silent politics of these kind of urban practices. And in both cases, what you sort of see, I think, is a move back to that idea that once we've established that media is embedded in cities, nonetheless we can kind of come up for air out of that sort of practical world and still point to how certain interests are doing very specific, purposeful, instrumental things through these sets of practices. So once again, we were kind of trying to kind of move around that style of political interpretation, which I think for us collectively, as we wrote the paper, was an example of sort of thinking too quickly, not slowing down and thinking, well, once you've established this nice idea of the urban media nexus, the embeddedness of media practices in urban practices, then if you slow down and think about how politics works, you might come up with different interpretations, which are slightly less instrumental, don't continue to give a very strong, powerful role to the media.
Indeed, I think both examples there really illustrate well how the political aspects of this play out in concrete contexts. And I know, Scott, that in the paper you and your co-authors are proposing a way of thinking about politics in a way that overcomes some of the limitations that there tends to be around how we think about the political. Now, this comes back to thinking about media as practices in particular, which we've discussed already, but in a kind of more expanded way. So what's missing in most current accounts of media practices?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, given its roots in audience research, the turn to media as practices invests quite a lot in the notion of the everyday. And this creates a particular problem for us because it seems to place more organized sets of media practices, what we might put under the umbrella of media production, as operating outside of practice. So media production tends to be seen as maybe strategically coherent, placed in an almost adversarial relationship with everyday practices. And then as a result, media practices as a concept gets conflated very often with the way media works in everyday life in particular. But if we want to, we're saying if we want to rethink media practices in urban politics, we also need to find a way to account for the practical basis of what are apparently larger scale actors, organizations, institutions, fields. And towards this, we turn to Theodore Schatzky's Ontology of sites, really for two key reasons. The first is that Schatzky provides us a way to conceptualize how technology, materiality relate to practices. So his site Ontology basically comes out of a sympathetic critique of writing in actor network theory, science and technology studies, some strands of post-humanist writing as well. And so because of that sympathetic critique, his starting point is really to assume a codependency between practices and material arrangements. But also, very importantly, the site Ontology implies an analytical priority on practices. So the concept of sites refers to how material arrangements are made legible as scenes, really, for a practical action. And so for us, this concept site provides a way to join this environmental view of media, the view that we see in the writing on media-urban nexus, with an emphasis at the same time on media as practices. Now, the second reason we turn to Schatzky's Ontology of sites is probably more central to our argument. And this is the emphasis that Schatzky places on the relationship between, on the one hand, the fine grain of practical action, and then on the other hand, more abstract assemblages, which are experienced, at least, as larger scale social entities, orders, fields. And of course, here we have echoes of someone like Pierre Bourdieu, particularly his concept of field. But what we found useful with Shatsky in particular is the sort of basic distinction that he draws between dispersed and integrative practices. So dispersed practices for Shatsky refer to just open-ended features of many activities. So these include apparently simple actions, things like describing, listening, handwriting, typing. Whereas integrative practices, by contrast, involve the ordering of many dispersed practices. So this refers really to how dispersed practices get bound together, are basically made intelligible by more abstract normative ends and emotions. And Shatsky has a term for this, which is that integrative practices have a teleoaffective structuring. So what does this distinction point out? Well, to begin with, it points out how dispersed media practices are the basic constituents of many types of integrative practices. So if we look at writers interested in media practices, quite understandably, they've tended to focus on the finer grain. So, for example, the complex articulation of hand movements in relation to a touchpad or eye movements in relation to a screen. But thinking about the relationship of dispersed and integrative media practices underlines the importance of situating that finer grain in relation to practical configurations that are experienced as larger scale, that are social entities or fields or orders. Now, the other important benefit of this notion of integrative practices is the renewed attention it invites to fields that are explicitly media related, so professions, organizations that we see as specifically of the media. And so it demands that we analyze these as well as geographically situated, as practically coordinated, as having their own rhythms and dynamics.
Right, so if I'm not mistaken, that takes us right back to the modest account of media power that we discussed earlier. Is that right, Clive?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we've been kind of skirting that issue a little bit, and the paper takes a long time to clear some space so we can get to this question of why we think we need to think more modestly about media power. And partly the answer follows from some things that have already been said, that at its simplest, the argument is that we should stop thinking about the idea that the media has a great deal of power, and that's because the concept of the media has in itself been, in a sense, been dispersed and displaced into a whole set of practices embedded in urban life. But a little bit more than that, I think there were a couple of aspects of what we mean by thinking more modestly about media power, or in a sense of what media or mediation does. One is kind of a follow-up from something Scott's already mentioned, of trying to extend that kind of practical imagination to kind of big institutions, the newspaper or firms or state agencies, that once one does that, and what that leads you to is a sense that those kind of organisations are ongoing practical achievements in much the same way that my ordinary life is, then that leads you to think that those organisations might therefore have much less coherent interests, much less obvious capacity to just achieve their goals. So that's one aspect of the more modest sense, I think. The second aspect is just to follow through, again, slowly as it were, the implication of the urban media Nexus story about the intrinsic embedded qualities of media in urban life. And that leads you to think, I think, in terms of the ways in which new media, in particular, much of these discussions are about so-called new media, really have to find ways of adjusting or fitting into existing rhythms of urban life. I mean, I think this is not necessarily a new story. My favourite example would be a kind of classic story from media studies, which you will be familiar with. Paddy Scannell's kind of wonderful work about the early history of radio, which is a story all about how people who were inventing radio broadcasting had to adjust to the ways in which everyday domestic routines worked, because they were obviously broadcasting into domestic spaces, and certain things didn't work. And I think that's there's an interesting general lesson there about how new media practices or technologies or even genres have to find a place within urban rhythms. A more recent example, or the work I have in mind more recently, is some of the work of James Ash, who, like Scott, is somebody at the nexus between geography and media studies. And James has done some interesting work about gaming, and particularly kind of the role of the designers in kind of developing gaming practices. And his I might be misrepresenting his work a little bit, but the bit I like about it is the sense that there's an awful lot of work having to go on by these designers to just make ordinary computer games work, to make them attuned to the expectations of gamers. Therefore, rather than thinking that what's going on through those kind of technologies is the configuration of people's subjectivities and so on, you have much stronger sense that actually the designers are trying to make things work, trying to make things fit, both into sort of everyday spatial rhythms, but also into the expectations that, in that case, their users have. So you sort of almost tipped over the story that rather than thinking that media is doing all this work, you're suddenly thinking that actually you have a series of stories about how media practices, technologies, genres, depending on what you're looking at, having to kind of attune or adjust to urban rhythms. And I think there's a more general sense of just thinking in terms of kind of actually, again, a classical old story about economies of attention, if you like. Again, a story which is standard one in certain sorts of media studies about how you have to do an awful lot of hard work to kind of build an audience, to attract an audience, to get them to watch, classically to get them to watch adverts, I suppose. But you can extend that, and some work more recently has been extending that idea of attention to new digital media as well. But it's has the same implication, I think, we feel, that when one begins to think about how ordinary people's attention has to be kind of captured, as it were, or at least caught, or how media have to adjust or align or attune to rhythms, you're suddenly thinking much more modestly, to come back to your question about what it is that media do, that media is not so much instrumentally configuring things, it's sort of finding places to fit. So I think that's the sense of modesty. It's not necessarily a modest argument we're making, but it's a grand argument about thinking modestly about what media can do.
Great. I think those are some very good practical illustrations, both of the arguments that you're making in this paper, but also the approach that the three of you have taken in writing it. I think sometimes there's a temptation when thinking about these issues to leap right into the grander scale. I know in my own research on protest cultures, there is this tendency to think about, say, the Arab Spring as being this very profound, powerful example of this nexus of media, politics, and cities. But Scott, it seems that the take-home message here really is that we need to look beyond these recent, more emblematic cases.
Right. I mean, we need to locate our thinking about media practices within a broader view of what we call the phenomenology of urban politics. And this means thinking about the conditions of possibility through which politics comes to be seen as urban. And in the conclusion, we outline two main dimensions to this. First, we're making the claim that the intensification of media through urban space creates basic conditions of possibility for political processes in general. So that is, political processes which might emerge from, yet also perhaps symbolically exceed a particular urban situation. And as we point out, this urban intensification of media happens across many fronts. So it's through media forms, technologies, infrastructures, so things like urban screens or wireless networks or hoardings, but also through media-related practices and activities, so things like mobile texting, watching TV in an airport lounge, listening to something like drive time radio, and as well through media-related industries. So there's a well-developed literature on various professional, semi-professional media and creative sector activities and the ways in which they tend to cluster in particular urban locales. So this intensification of media through urban space helps form the basic conditions of possibility for political claims and also for political collectivities, which might extend beyond a specific localized urban setting. Now, the second dimension involves, in a way, a qualified return to the media, media with the definite article. Qualified, I guess, because we're speaking about the media in terms of integrative practice, first of all, but also then extending this beyond symbolic production and also including technical forms of media production. So not just making the news, but also things like software design, which Clive mentioned earlier. So the media in this revised form should be seen as basic conditions of possibility for the urban to be named or to appear as an object of political attention. So media production practices, and there's a long history to this, haven't only been seen to circulate an awareness of or an interest in a common urban world, but by doing that, they've also been seen to make it possible to speak for the urban as a political space. So this second dimension involves thinking about how, through various media-related fields of organized practice, interests and problems show up as specifically urban. So we're suggesting we need to take these two dimensions together. And if we do that, we might begin to take on a broader, hopefully more intrinsic, perhaps more modest view of media than we conventionally see in accounts of urban politics.
Right, well, I think that's a good set of points to end on. I'd like to thank Scott, Clive and Allan for talking about their paper with me today.